In some ways, it's just a reminder that Western Christians don't have a copyright on Christianity, copyright on Jesus, copyright on the Bible, right?
Copyright on
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Okay. 1, 2, ready, go.
Welcome to the Called to Be Bad podcast. My name is Mariah Martin, and I feel called to be bad. It turns out I'm not the only one. Join us as we dig into all things bad, scandalous, deviant, you know, the stuff that makes good church folks squirm in the sanctuary. Why? Well, because sometimes the scandalous is spiritual, deviant is divine, and bad is beautiful. Say yes to the call, and let's see what holy trouble we get into today. Hello, Drew.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. Welcome to Call to Be Bad. Today I have Drew Hart as our guest. Drew is a public theologian and a professor of theology at Messiah University. He has 10 years of pastoral ministry experience, and he's the recipient of multiple awards for peacemaking. He has written a book, Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism, which I don't have on me, but I do have his second book, Who Will Be a Witness, in Igniting Activism for God's Justice, Love, and Deliverance. And we're going to be talking a little bit about I don't know, I guess it's a theme within this book. But yeah, anything else you want to add to our introduction?
Yeah, there's a couple things that I've been up to beyond those things. One is the co-host for Inverse Podcasts and also overseeing the Inverse Collective community. It's a global podcast. We interview really interesting guests from all different traditions all around the world and invite them to tell their story and to just learn a little bit about how they read scripture and whether it is liberative or oppressive, and try to reimagine what it means to read scripture in ways that turn the world upside down. The other thing that I do, I'm a director for a program at Messiah University that we launched last year. It's called Thriving Together, Congregations for Racial Justice. And so we're working with local congregations, coming alongside them and helping them understand the local history of race and place as well as the national, and then thinking about ways that they can actually engage in transforming and changing our communities at the root level, right, at the systemic level of some of these injustices that are impacting our neighbors and those that are most vulnerable. And so it's been a delight for me to work with these congregations from all different traditions, denominations, black churches, white churches, multiracial churches, both sides of the river, which is a big deal here in central PA. And so, that's some of the work that I've been doing along with other organizing work that I do in my area.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds like a really neat program. So today we're going to be talking about the tie between white supremacy and Christianity. A quote from your book kind of stood out for me. You had an interaction with someone who said that Christianity is a white man's religion. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. Before we get into all things Christianity and white supremacy, I'm curious, Drew, what you are drinking today.
Well, in recent years, I've had to kind of back off of some stronger caffeinated drinks, but still need just a little bit, to keep me going. And so one of the things I've been drinking a lot of, I got to get the buzz. So I drink a lot of green tea. So that's what I've got with me today. I've got green tea, and I've actually, what's it, stevia, the other alternative.
Stevia.
I've been using that recently as well. So no actual sugar calories. So anyway, that's what I've got with me today to keep me warm and keep me buzzing just a little bit.
Yes. I've talked to quite a few people who have really cut back on caffeine, and it makes me wonder if that would be. I only drink like 1 cup a day, so, or like 1 mug, sometimes decaf in the afternoons, but anyways, I do have coffee. I have just black coffee, and I didn't know what mug to pick. I didn't have anything about white supremacy, believe it or not, so I just picked one with some cute animals and a really cheesy saying that I don't know that I want to say because it's so cheesy. So yeah, that's what I'm drinking today. Hello, beloved baddies. A quick break to tell you that this episode is sponsored by the Center for Art, Humor, and Soul, a nonprofit that supports and amplifies the voices of edgewalkers through art that catalyzes change, laughter that brings us together, and soul awakening to the creative spark within us. The support from the Center for Art, Humor, and Soul has meant the world to this podcast. So I highly encourage you to check out their website, arthumorandsoul.com, to see their other featured artists and projects. If you want to support the podcast, you can check out our Patreon or get in touch. Now I'll let you get back to this episode of Called to Be Bad. But yeah, so white supremacy, it seemed like a theme of your book, and I'm curious, like, I want to hear that story about that person who told you that Christianity was a white man's religion. But we alwané start with definitions on the podcast. So how would you define white supremacy or whiteness? I mean, that's kind of a really big, hard question to dive in with. But
yeah. No, that's a great question. And I'll start with white supremacy first, because maybe that's the more important starting point. Then we can talk about whiteness.
Sure.
White supremacy, I mean, there's a few different ways that we could talk about it. But I think one of the ways I like talking about it is as an organizing principle, right? It's an organizing principle. It's a way of organizing our society and our lives. And so to think about why, are some neighborhoods and communities, school districts being overfunded or have access to resources, right? Other neighborhoods have dealt with histories of like redlining and, not having access to loans and, underfunded schools and intentional plundering and removal of resources, right? There's a way in which, even on a geographic level, we've organized our entire society around the principle of white supremacy. So I think maybe that's a starting point. So that's why a lot of people will talk about then racism in general being a system rather than just, personal prejudice. And so that organizing principle, though, is how white supremacy is functioning. That's the principle behind how we are making sense and organizing our society. At least one of them. You could also argue the flip side of that is anti-blackness, but we could have a whole nother conversation on that. So you have the organizing principle, but it's also an ideological and value system as well. Like, it's an ideology that's built on the myth and idea of hierarchy, right, based on race. And so white supremacy claims that white bodies, white culture, that white ideas, that they are superior, more valued than all other forms. And so we can pay attention to the myths and narratives that have been told over and over again that create and sustain these ideologies and beliefs. And then maybe another way of also just making it plain, right? White supremacy is justification, right? It's a justification of why the world is the way it is, or why people can treat people in particular ways and not believe it to be evil, right? To not believe it to be harmful. And so when Europeans are first coming over, they didn't actually have a developed system of white supremacy in place. That thing is something that developed over time to justify those actions, right?
Yeah.
And so it got more nuanced and more sophisticated as the years went. But those things were, in some ways, those were the ideas that were always needed for humans to be able to wake up and look at themselves in the morning and not see themselves as like doing horrific, inhumane actions to others, right? So long as this people group, they're savages or barbaristic or they're dangerous or criminal or whatever kind of framework we're creating and constructing, so long as those things are believed, then what we're doing is fine, right? These things. And so white supremacy becomes a justification for plunder, a justification for social domination over other non-white bodies, and over lands as well. So that would be white supremacy for me. Probably a good, there's other ways we could talk about it, but for now, that organizing principle, thinking about it, the ideological value system, thinking about it as a justification. And then I would add, and you could maybe I'll add one more and say it is
Sure.
optics too, right? Sometimes we
Okay.
don't think about how white supremacy is a lens through which we see the world, so that it shapes how we see and how we're seen, right? How we see others, how we would like to think that our eyes don't lie to us, but that we actually get filters through white supremacy that reinterpret everything that we're seeing in the world. And so once you've adopted white supremacy, you could see a white person running down the road and you're like, oh, they're going for a nice jog. You see a black person going down the road, like, oh, what did they steal? What are they up to? I got to go chase them, right? And so there's the optics of it as well that I think maybe is also an important piece to that. But there's so many dynamics, but I think those are maybe some good starting points. Whiteness, the way I talk about whiteness, the primary way I focus on talking about whiteness is in terms of socialization. It's the way that we've been formed into the world, and it's trying to form people to conform to a particular idea, right? A particular standard, a particular form that we ought to pursue, achieve. And so you got to think of it in terms of like historically, so if we took a time machine to the 14th century, right? So me and you go back and let's say we plop ourselves in what would now be Germany, and we're like, oh, let's get all the white people together, right? They would not know what we're talking about. They would look at us very strange because they don't identify as whites, and they certainly don't identify with all Western Europeans as whites, right? So there's had to be a process of socialization that actually changes one's sense of identity and how one relates to others in the world, and tells them the proper way to be in the world, a proper way to move, a proper way to think and live in relation to others, right? Now, of course, I'm using proper in maybe it goes good with this thing, right? Not in a good sense here in this case,
Right, yeah.
but precisely in the sense that it is re-socializing people, or we could even say in the Christian sense, discipling people into a different way of being, right?
Yeah.
And so whiteness is the internalizing of white supremacy and living by those myths. It is fully aligning with the organizing principle that is white supremacy. It is adopting the ideological value systems, and it is living by those justifications that says my family deserves better than their family. They're bad, dangerous people. We're good, innocent people. And so we can look at maybe some of the best ways to understand how whiteness works is to see the folks on the fringes of it and how they've navigated, or some that were used to be at the fringes, right? So what does it mean to think about communities? The easy examples would be Irish and Italian communities that were, when they came over, on one hand, you could say they were considered white, and on the other hand, they always had an asterisk by their name, right? Not properly white initially, and often looked down upon as not being properly white. And so what do many communities do that are not? So in the U.S., the center of whiteness was Anglo-Saxon Protestantism. That's not the same globally, right? But in the U.S., that was the center. And so what did people do? They intentionally pursued and assimilated and gravitated closer to that skeleton of white supremacy. So for some white people, that meant anglicizing their names, right? Cutting off ties from language and customs and heritage, forgetfulness of their own particularity. All of these moves as parts of trying to achieve proper whiteness. Right, to be deemed properly white. And that also then means how one relates to others who are non-white, right? And so there's large histories in these kind of awkward stages of Irish and Italian communities of severe anti-black racism happening precisely as they're trying to prove or achieve whiteness in the fullest sense of the meaning. Certainly Mennonites have grappled, right, with this space of trying to prove proper whiteness, how to become fully and properly white. And so there's all kinds of conversations we could have about how Anabaptist communities, Eurocentric, Anabaptist communities have kind of navigated that space as well.
Can you say a little bit more about that? Because
Yeah.
I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
Let's go there.
Let's go there. So one of the really fascinating things I think about the historic Anabaptist denominations, and particularly, let's go to a group that we wouldn't normally think of in terms of talking about white supremacy. Let's talk about the Amish, right? It's actually quite fascinating to think about how white supremacy has and has not worked in that community. And I think it can be enlightening for all kinds of communities to think through. Because the Amish, one of the most fascinating things I find is that when you learn about some of the rhetoric that goes back quite a while, is that they used to call the rest of the world the English, right? And so you have this framework, the English. And to me, that's very fascinating. Again, in a context where white supremacy is being most expressed through Anglo-Saxon Protestant identity. And so there is a way in which, on one hand, there's this pushback against, right, that being the norm. There's a resistance to that. Naming it as the world, tying the world and the English together is, in one way, rejecting the calls to white supremacy on one hand, right? And yet, of course, they're also then participating in the white supremacist project, right? They're coming over, they're taking land, they're benefiting. They can only do these things on the benefits of land. They're stealing, maybe not physically the ones taking the indigenous people's lands, but they're certainly acquiring them on pennies on the dollar, right, for no problem at all. And so you have this really kind of complicated space where they are both white, but also with an asterisk still in some ways, right? They have not fully assimilated all the way into whiteness, but they have embodied and practiced whiteness enough so that their particularity hides a little bit of the ways that they're actually participating in the system and benefiting from the system and being advantaged by the system as well. And so both of those things are happening simultaneously, right? And I think then we could think about then for Mennonite communities and other more contemporary expressions of, Anabaptist witness and the ways that they've navigated. And I would say many have assimilated more and more and more into white dominant culture, right? And so that's some of the tensions there. There is this awareness of another alternative story that's resisting, right? The way that Anabaptists talk about their history, and also an assimilation into white dominant culture and benefiting from the system. So both of those things kind of coexist.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like there's that big of a leap to make from Amish communities to, even modern day Mennonites. Like the church communities that I participate in, because we still have that narrative of kind of resistance or going against, mainstream theology or society, but there is kind of this insidious layer to it of, still having proximity to whiteness, to white supremacy. Yeah, that's fascinating. And also, I wonder if the kind of the martyrdom history plays a role in we're not that bad because, look what we came from, I don't know.
Right. Yeah, no, there's no question that I think the martyrdom narratives and this kind of pseudo minority kind of identity, right?
Yes.
I think is present. That it does two things. Like it does, I think, actually help Mennonites be more open, but it also obscures their own participation and complicity, right? And so like some of the time, I felt like in some Mennonite spaces that I've spoken to, I've got to remind them that they're white. Like y'all are white too, right? Because it's almost like, yeah, those bad white people out there, right? No, I'm talking to y'all right now, right? In the ways that you also have contributed and participated in these systems. And so I think, but it does create space where maybe there's less defensiveness when naming white supremacy that maybe I might not experience, if I'm before a white American conservative evangelical congregation, right? It's maybe not going to be the same exact kind of conversation that we're going to have, and the kind of moves that you need to get to even name the elephant in the room. I think maybe it's different, but the obscuring is there. And so I think the way that Mennonite identity often hides assimilation into white identity, right? So like, think about this. I've shared this before. So I've got friends in Philly. I got a friend, my homie Ness, he's from Philly, born and raised in Philly. When he was young, he actually was in a Mennonite church, then eventually left it, and then came back as an adult and has been in the Mennonite church ever since. But what's fascinating is that my friend Ness, he'll say, I'm not Mennonite, I'm an urban Anabaptist. That's what he says, right?
Oh.
All right. So he doesn't claim the identity of Mennonite, even though he was born into a Mennonite congregation in Philly and also is at this, urban, multiracial Mennonite congregation now. He doesn't identify as Mennonite. On the other hand, I've heard and I think this person was from Canada, a white woman who once said, I'm not white, I'm Mennonite. Right? And so between those two experiences, they're like, what's actually happening here, right?
Yeah.
That clearly Mennonite as an identity has been racialized. Not everyone that even lives within the community and even finds value in it necessarily can identify with its label and identity precisely because it's been racialized with whiteness, right? And I think that we have to kind of grapple with the ways that it's also obscuring some things just as much as it is particular identity, which is good. Like, I think the particularity of it is a healthy thing, so long as it doesn't do sleight of hand to cover up participation in white dominant culture.
Yeah. Yeah, so do you think it's like, because I have felt this like in myself, and I've seen this in my friends, my peers. Is it like a progressive thing or a Mennonite thing, or you can't really, or a progressive Mennonite thing to kind of like that the desire to say like, well, I'm not like other Christians, I'm not like other people who are racist, or this like, okay, like very much claiming like, yeah, I have been racist in these spaces. It almost makes it, there's almost like this like you get this like this badge of like, okay, I'm a good Mennonite because I can name and see where I have participated in racist systems. Are you getting where I'm
Yeah,
kind of
I mean, I think both
going?
of those things are usually happening simultaneously, right? Yeah, it's like,
Okay.
there is this, we're not like them. I mean, I remember,
Yeah.
so I did a whole talk and thing at this white progressive Mennonite church. I won't name which one. Actually, I don't even remember which congregation it was. But what was fascinating was during the Q&A conversation that we were having, someone said, so what do you say to those conservative churches, right? And I was like, actually, very similar to what I just shared to you. That's what I said to them, which I think was a blow to their ego a little bit.
Yeah.
But they wanted to imagine that they're in this completely different place, right? And it's like, no, like, you guys are still swimming in white supremacy and are just oblivious to, just because you're progressive doesn't mean that you've conquered white supremacy. If you haven't intentionally, right, done decolonizing work and deconstructing how racism is embedded in your life, then just being progressive is not some out, right? And being white progressive Mennonites is not just being an out. Now, that said, that doesn't mean that, like, I imagine, at this particular church, who was I mean, it was a few years ago, and I think they were just trying to get serious about having, like, conversations as a congregation. Like, if I was at a white conservative church, maybe the big difference would be is that, they might not have invited me to come have that conversation. I don't get invited to that many white conservative evangelical congregations to have this conversation, right? But in terms of the lack of self-examination, I would say is probably equal. It just plays out differently only because Anabaptists have a narrative in place around Christendom and around Constantine and how they see themselves in relationship then to other Christians, right? I think that those kind of ideas create space But the problem is that even as Anabaptists like to make other Christian communities feel bad about themselves for participating in Christendom, they haven't actually pulled that out to the full conclusions in terms of, at least historically, have not fleshed it out from Christendom to colonialism, right? And seeing those things as intertwined and interconnected with one another. So I think that, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. There is openness. There is some willingness. I think sometimes Mennonites can enjoy beating themselves on the back. Oh, we're racist. All our white privilege, right? There's some of that happens sometimes, but there's also this distancing from everyone else that's actually not allowing them to actually fully see their full complicity. Yeah.
Yeah. There's something there, and I'm skipping ahead of all of our questions, but I guess that's okay. But why is it so hard for us to, for some of us to admit that racism is real, that white supremacy is a thing? Why do we want to deny that so badly? Especially Christians. Is it because we are so caught up in this identity of being good? I don't know. I feel like there's something with not wanting to be bad, wanting to be good, because good people, I don't know, go to heaven, are more like Jesus. Do we or do we just not want to take responsibility? And then that means we have to work and change, and it's oh no, we're saved, so we don't have to do any of that. I don't know. That's something that I was playing with, but I didn't know how to formulate in a formal question for you.
Yeah. I think there's a lot there as it relates to identity, right? A sense of self that is actually tied up in this that makes it really complicated and hard work, right? Because if once you come to the realization that white supremacy is not just about the bad racists and the bad people who just want to do bad things to other people, right? Once it gets a little more nuanced and we're like, oh, even folks with good intentions are tied up into all of this in a whole variety of ways, right? Entangled. And once you actually grapple with the full weight of it and its implications in terms of how it has shaped communities and sense of identity in oneself, then all of a sudden it's oh, wait a minute. I'm talking about grandma, grandpa. I'm talking about my parents. I'm talking about me. I'm talking about my faith community. I'm talking about all the positive experiences all the nostalgia of my experiences, and saying all those things are tainted with white supremacy also, right? And what does it mean to some of your most meaningful experiences, intimate, and say there was something still off about that, right? Not that everything was bad, that there was no redeeming quality. I'm not saying that, but to say that embedded in all of that, white supremacy was entangled and mangled up in it. Even from there, it's that is a harder thing to kind of internalize and make sense of. It takes a little more a deeper kind of confessional spirit, more repentant kind of posture, and a kind of commitment to deeper kind of decolonizing and transformative kind of approach to how we break out of this thing, right? And I think that it's much easier to look at the bad, ways of, oh, I thought this bad thought once, and I should have never thought like that, right? Or I remember. And so we still, even out of our own lived experiences, we might still create isolated exceptions that we can condemn. Okay. Oh, that was bad. I shouldn't have done that. Or there was this period of time in my life where I didn't realize, X, Y, Z, but we're not actually seeing that.
But I'm over that now.
I'm over that now. Yeah. And so we're not doing the deeper, harder work.
Yeah. Rather than just seeing, like you were saying with optics, rather than looking through the perspective of it is, it's in the water. It's everywhere. It reminds me weirdly of have you seen the movie Get Out?
Yes.
Right. Yeah. It reminds me of so the main character is a black man, and he has been dating this white woman, and she goes to take him home to her white family for a weekend. And spoiler alert if you haven't watched Get Out. Turns out this white family is crazy and tries to, like, brainwash. Anyways, my point here is, at the end of this movie, the main character has to look back on his relationship with this woman and realize that she has been terrible this whole time. And, like, just how of a, like, you just have to, like, I mean, okay, the best word I can think of is, like, a mind fuck. Of, like, oh, it's been bad this whole time. Anyways, I don't know why my brain made that connection, but...
Yeah,
I mean, I think
but
a
it
little bit
is because so with the it's seeing everything in a whole new light, right? You have everything has been filtered through white supremacy, and now we have to kind of see everything new. And again, it doesn't mean that everyone is evil or whatever. Like that's not
Right.
what I'm getting at. But it all is tainted by white supremacy, and I think that especially in faith communities, that's a bit harder to kind of comprehend when we're thinking about intimate encounters with God, our sense of spirituality, our sense of morality, all of these things, our theological imagination, all of that is tainted by white supremacy.
It's like kind of like capitalism. Like
Yeah.
you can't. It's like that. Our society, our economy is built is capitalism. We can't operate outside of capitalism.
Yep.
Huh. Okay. So, getting back to one of our questions, I do want to hear the story of when this person said that Christianity is a white man's religion and how you responded. And if it happened today, would you respond differently? And I just thought that your response was really intriguing, how you answered his question.
Yeah. So let's see. So this was when I was still in Philly, and if you've been to Philly, you know that there's, especially in like North Philly and such, there's a strong Black Muslim community there, and so it's not strange to have Black Muslim neighbors and such. And so I had one neighbor, Rafiq, who we got along very well. We play basketball together sometimes. He would cook out and share food over the porches and such, you know. But he would every now and then try to say something just to try to, you know, get at you a little bit and see how you responded. So one day he randomly just out of nowhere said that Christianity was the white man's religion. It really didn't flow in the conversation. It was just him being provocative.
He was planning it.
He was being
waiting.
provocative. He wanted to
Yeah.
just see how I responded.
Those people are kind of my favorite kind of people.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. It wasn't even like mean how he said it, but
Right.
it was a little antagonistic, but in like a playful, I'm going to
Yeah.
antagonize you a little bit, but it wasn't like mean. Anyway, so he said that, and so I kind of, and I knew his backstory. Like he grew up actually in a Black Baptist church, so he was raised in the church, and ended up leaving, you know, the church behind, leaving faith in Jesus behind, and so he had some intimate connections to Christianity, but also has internalized a very different tradition that has been a little bit more vocally critical of Christianity, right? And so my response to him was kind of twofold. One was I wanted to first kind of name the ways in which, you know, he was, at least from a historical standpoint, a bit off on the history of Christianity, right? And so talking about the fact that Christianity is not indigenous to the West. It's not indigenous to Europe. White people, in some ways, it's just a reminder that Western Christians don't have a copyright on Christianity, copyright on Jesus, copyright on the Bible, right?
Copyright on
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah. Some think they have it, but they don't. But then, on the other hand, I also wanted, and this is maybe a more confessional posture, is to name the fact that, in fact, it has been weaponized as a white man's religion also, right? In terms of how it has actually been used within history, right? And so thinking about, you know, colonial conquest and plunder and enslavement, all these ways in which we continue to see, even now up to the present day, white Christian nationalism, there's a way in which it has been used as an ideological weapon to, you know, it has functioned as the white man's religion. And we have to kind of be able to name the way that it actually has been used in the world. Even if I can say that's not its origins, it does little that means very little when that's how it's functioning in the
How
world
it's
today.
happening, yeah.
Right. And so kind of doing both of those things simultaneously was kind of really important to me, that we can tell the truth that kind of undermines white supremacist myths that have kind of centered Christianity and made Jesus, whitened Jesus and whitened, God to be some white grandpa in the sky or something like that. And at the same time, that we have to confess and name, the harm that a mangled, diseased Christianity has played out globally, not just here in the U.S.
Yeah. How did he respond to that?
I don't think he didn't really. I think we went back for it a little bit. He didn't have that much
He
to
was
say.
speechless.
I don't
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
but I don't think
He
that
was like, "Oh, he came prepared. I wasn't." He was just trying to throw you off. He
he's
didn't
just
know that you
messing.
would get like a
serious.
lesson.
I probably got more serious than he was anticipating, but I don't. I mean, I don't know if that didn't necessarily like convince him. Like, oh, now
Yeah.
here I come back to Jesus. It wasn't that kind of moment, but it was. I think it's important to undermine white supremacist Christianity, and I think that we've got to tell the truth first before we can begin to invite people into something more beautiful.
Yeah. And I think that like you acknowledged, it always throws people off when you're like, yeah, you're right. And acknowledge that he probably has pain there.
Right.
And that pain is valid and real, and you weren't like, no, that doesn't exist, and like brush over all of that.
Yep.
Yeah. Do you have any other stories of that might be helpful for people listening to kind of grapple with Christianity and its tie to white supremacy?
Yeah, I mean, I got tons, but I'll share one
Yeah.
story that I know people have resonated from my first book.
Okay.
So when I lived in Harrisburg, right after I graduated college, I lived there. I was a youth pastor and working at an after-school program, and I was living in the Allison Hill section, which is actually where I live now again. And it's a majority black and brown community. Historic racism, one of the poorest communities in the area. And in Allison, this one particular day, I'm driving down Market Street, which is like one of the main, streets in the community. And I'm going 17th Street, 15th Street, 14th Street. And right around that area, there are just not a lot of white people that live there. Like, you just don't see a lot of white people. Now, Allison Hill actually, at one time, was a historic white community. And then there was, massive white flight that took place. And now it's a mostly black and brown community, a lot of Latinx and black folks that live in that section. And so this day I'm driving, and as I look over, I see lots of white people there. I mean, there are just white people, this big, a clump of white people on the side of the street in a part of town where you just don't see white people, don't really hang out there. And what's fascinating as I'm driving is I notice that they're all wearing bright yellow t-shirts. So they're almost glowing, they want to be seen and no one's missing them because they all got matching bright yellow t-shirts on. And on the side of the street, there's this pickup truck, and they've got grocery bags, and they're just handing it out as people are walking down the street. They're handing their grocery bags to people as they're walking down the street. And I'm thinking well, first I'm thinking it's a youth group. Then I saw what they were doing. I was like, it didn't look like a youth group. It looked a little older, maybe young adults or such. And I'm thinking oh, that's not the best way to distribute resources, kind of random, just randomly giving out bags. If I wasn't late to my meeting, I would have stopped and got free bags because it was like Oprah, you get a bag, you get a bag. Everybody gets a bag, right?
Everybody
gets a bag. And so at this point, I don't really care, but I'm driving just oh, silly church folk. That's what I'm thinking now. That's my assumption. I get a little bit closer, and right as I'm passing them, I see on their shirt, and it says, Harrisburg Invasion. And at that point, then it's not funny anymore, right? Then I'm kind of pissed off. I'm like, what the hell? Why do they have Harrisburg Invasion on their shirt? They're literally planning to come in and invade our community. That's the frame that they're and
posture.
Right, that's the posture. And it's it's not that I'm oblivious to like white savior complexes. Like I know that it exists, but it's not usually like the name of the motto, right? The
It's
motto
not
name
like
is like
so obvious.
you hide
like,
that part of
yeah.
it, right? But like literally, it's like white saviors here, right? Like that's almost like we're just like poor, helpless black and brown folk just waiting for some white saviors to come do their 24-hour drive by and help us, right? And so I was really pissed at that, and I remember afterwards talking to some folks and asking them about like what was going on, and apparently there's white churches on the other shore. So in Harrisburg, the West Shore, we call it the White Shore, and it's because it's literally historic. I mean, racially restricted deeds on homes. There's even some sundown and hostility, all kinds of stuff that intentionally for a long time kept black people from moving onto the West Shore. So
Wow.
it still has that reputation. It's become a little bit more diverse. Usually not black, that many black people, a little bit, but it's mostly other immigrants who are moving in. So that's made it a little bit more diverse, but it's still overwhelmingly white, given Harrisburg is like a 50% black and also has a large Latinx community as well. Anyway, so all that happens, and they tell me that these white West Shore churches collaborate together once a year, and they do this little Invasion Day thing. And I was thinking about it, and I was like, all right, why am I so angry? Like what is it that's like frustrating me about this experience? And I had to think like, all right, it's not it's not like 1850. They're not coming in and trying to enslave African people, right? Like they're not enslaving us. And it's not 1915 or something. They're not trying to set up a Jim Crow system, right? Like that's not what's going on. So they're coming in and they're handing out groceries. Why am I so upset, right? What is it exactly that I'm upset about? And for me, when I thought about it, it was that even with what I believe they had really good intentions, right? I'm confident that they had good intentions, that even with that, the racial hierarchy was still in place, right? They still came in thinking that they had everything to give and nothing to receive, right? They came in kind of oblivious to the actual local contextual realities, the leadership, the amazing stuff that was already happening all over the place in that community, right? I was one of just many people who were doing really great work on the ground. And I think like there were so many areas where things could have gone differently. Like they could have called up the phone and said, let's call up so-and-so. Let's call up Brother Joe and see, if they want us to give out groceries today. And he might say, no, you can keep your groceries, but we could use XYZ, right? Come alongside and come under the existing leadership who was already there. And so I think there were opportunities, but it would have required a different imagination or a different way of being rather than the one they had been socialized into, right? They've been socialized to always to be the teacher and never the student, right? And they needed, if they were going to take seriously Jesus' teachings that the first are last and the last are first, they would have needed to reverse that, to come under, right, and to be the learners, not the leaders. And I think that even the way that many white Christians imagine what it means to be a servant, right? Christian service has been inverted from Jesus' inversion. That is to say, the way Jesus teaches about what it means to be a servant is to actually come on the underside of the hierarchy, right? Mm-hmm. And what has happened in white imagination is it's actually done the opposite of that. It has inverted that inversion so that now even being service is about everything that I have, right? And it's a posture of hierarchy over those who don't have and who are needy, supposedly, right? And so they don't see their own need for liberation, their own need for transformation. They just see other people's needs. Yes. When in reality, they should have came recognizing, or ideally would have came recognizing that they're entangled in white supremacy, that their own humanity had been dehumanized, and that they needed liberation, right? And that maybe somehow, if coming under the leadership of those who've been on the underside already, right, from the vantage point of what I call the crucified Christ, then maybe somehow they might have found a deeper encounter with God and others. Yeah.
Yeah. That reminds me of the feeling. I have a friend who worked in a local store, and there would often be groups of other white folks who would come in and try and evangelize to her. And she's like, I'm already Christian, like, why? It's the assumption that the other, that you have something that the other person doesn't, without asking, like, hey, do you need this? I have a different friend that works with clean water solutions, and they went to the Virgin Islands, and I heard this story where after a hurricane, a bunch of folks sent supplies to the island. Is it island? It's the Virgin Islands. But the problem was they didn't like ask what the people needed, and so they sent like parkas and high heels and like all these things that they just didn't want, but it felt good to say like, oh, here's my things, I'm helping people. Right. And but the thing is the people on the island have to pay for the ships to come in and disembark. Is that the word?
I think so.
So they ended up paying more to get all of the stuff that they didn't need than, like, it's just like not helpful. And so it comes back to this assumption and posture of, I have something that you need. And yeah. It's understandable that you were very frustrated in that situation. I just can't believe that they had the audacity to call it invasion. Like, that's so icky to me.
So here's a funny story to that, right?
Yeah.
So I had that experience. That would have been, I can't remember the exact year, but it would have been between 2005 and 2008, right? That happened. And then, as the years went on, I began to do more and more like anti-racism work with churches. And I always like to use stories. So that's one of the stories that I would tell. And after a while, I started like second guessing myself. I was like, no, there's no way somebody would actually put Harrisburg Invasion on a yellow shirt and go out and do serve. Like,
you're gaslighting yourself.
I literally began to gaslight myself, and I was like, no, nobody would actually. This is a little too extreme, Drew. Nobody's that silly that they would do that.
Right.
So after a while, I actually began to Google, and I looked, and then I found like images with the Harrisburg. Mm-hmm. So actually, I use the images now, but it's funny because
the proof.
Right, here's the proof. And I think it's more for me than for other people, I think, because I for a while almost like didn't believe after, like 10 years in, like, no, nobody would actually do this. Drew, like, how did I begin making this story up, right? And then I was like, okay, I'm not crazy. This actually did happen.
Here's the receipts.
Yeah, here's my receipts. Yeah, exactly.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Well, one thing that I appreciated about your book is that you talked about, or you're inviting your readers to develop Jesus-shaped imaginations, which I think is a really, I just appreciate that. We can't live into something that we can't first imagine. So what does that mean to you? What does your Jesus-shaped imagination look like in terms of white supremacy and Christianity?
Yeah. So I guess for me, the first part of it is to be immersed in a different story, right? Mm-hmm. So, and we could talk about the scriptural story first, Israel's story and encounter and pursuit of God, and then that fulfilled in the Jesus story, right? And so the life, the teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And what does it mean to be immersed into this counter narrative, this counter story that actually challenges empire, that challenges the systems of domination, that challenges cycles of violence, right? And then within it, to imagine a new future, a new possibility. I think of it in terms of shalom, right? All of creation, right? In harmony, all of creation healed, all of creation interdependence in the presence of God, right? What does it mean to imagine, to get a glimpse? I think of Isaiah, right? A glimpse of this new heaven, new creation that we're kind of moving towards. And then to think about that in light of where we are and to imagine what would it look like for Allison Hill, where I live, right? For it to flourish and for it to thrive and for it to heal and for there to be justice. Like, what does that look like, and how do I pursue that on the ground tangibly and concretely? So yeah, for me, it all starts though with the Jesus story, right? Jesus's story and the radical revolutionary implications that it has for helping us have new filters. It's a new, you could say shalom is a new organizing principle, right? It's a new value
It's a
system.
new old. It's a new old new.
Old, new,
old.
right, right.
Yeah.
But it allows us to enter in and to see the world anew from where we are currently living and what we've accustomed ourselves to in the present world.
Yeah, yeah, I like that. So I ask everyone who comes on the podcast, what would you say if someone said that you were a bad, insert whatever identity cuts closest to home. So theologian, pastor, whatever would hurt the most, I guess, for your your passion, your writing, talking about the ways that white supremacy has caught up Christianity in this like vice grip. So
Yeah, so if
what
someone
would you say?
said I was a bad, whether it be disciple or theologian either,
Yeah, there you go.
I would say good, right? That given the normative expressions of Christianity and what has been defined as good for so long, which is centuries of plunder, centuries of domination, centuries of dehumanization. The only good Christian is a bad Christian in that context, right? And that Jesus also would be defined as a bad Christian, given our current definitions of what gets praised and what gets honored and gets most recognized in our present society. And so I think that going back to this idea of a Jesus imagination is to suggest that right underneath the nose of the empire, right, is being birthed a different way of life that we can participate in. But it's going to be hostile to, subversive to our prevailing social order as it is today, and will be judged by different value systems. And so I guess, if I don't know, should I name names, if some of these white Christian nationalists, went public and said Drew Hart is a bad theologian, I think that's a badge of honor, right? To receive that. I'm not saying I'll enjoy it, maybe some of the backlash, because
Right.
I've gotten some hate mail occasionally and stuff like that. It happens when you do stuff in the public square, but
Yeah.
I think that in the grand scheme of things, it's a badge of honor.
So it lines up with your. So would it be too far to say your Jesus-shaped imagination involves being bad?
Absolutely. For this world, for the world as it is, absolutely, right? Based on how we are invited to live in this world,
Yeah.
we must misbehave.
Yes. Yes, I love that. So yeah, do you have any final thoughts or advice or resources to share? Again, you can email me some things I can put in the description. But any final thoughts for folks who are trying to struggle against white supremacy and whiteness?
Yeah. Well, I'll just share that again, as it relates to my two books. Like, one of the things that I think it's most helpful for folks is I've tried to write stuff that is very accessible. My first book, even more so than even the second one, it's just extremely accessible. It's even shorter in terms of length than Who Will Be a Witness, and it's a resource that can be used in congregations and in small groups. And I think people have found it very helpful precisely because it does do the theological work, but in a very accessible way and through story and engagement and scriptural imagination and all of that. And then Who Will Be a Witness invites people to go even deeper in terms of the racial justice work that we can kind of get into in response to the world that has been shaped around us. And so, I invite people to stay on the journey. Check me out on Inverse Podcasts. Catch me. I do quite a bit of speaking and traveling, and so you can catch up with me during one of the events that I'm participating in as well.
Perfect. Yeah, I don't know how I don't have your first one. I need to get my hands on it, but got the second one. Well, it's tradition on the podcast to end with a blessing. So would it be okay, Drew, if I bless you and all of our baddies out there watching or listening to this episode?
Absolutely.
Okay. Drew and all of you beautiful baddies, may you go from this episode with a new lens, a new desire for a Jesus-shaped imagination, one that doesn't live out your life through the lens of whiteness, but strives to reimagine what it would look like to live, to exist within shalom that, reimagines relationship and thriving and flourishing. So go with that fire, that desire to be bad. Be bad for Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
That's all for this episode of Called to Be Bad. Keep being your bad, beautiful selves, and I will see you next time.